Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the UW Now. Following Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, tensions between China, Taiwan, and the U.S. have intensified. Taiwan plays a central role in the global semiconductor industry, giving it outsized economic and strategic importance to the world. What would be the impact if Taiwanese chips vanished from the market? What role do Taiwanese semiconductors play in U.S. national security? More broadly, can Taiwan remain autonomous indefinitely? And is strategic ambiguity still the U.S. policy toward Taiwan? And if so, is it the right policy, and is it being implemented effectively? How can this issue be navigated to minimize the economic, political, and human fallout? We're fortunate to have three experts from the UW community to help us unpack the root causes and potential implications of the tensions over Taiwan. Mike Splinter is a board member at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation and chairman of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council. Yeung is professor of practice in the College of Engineering with vast experience in the tech industry in Taiwan, China, and Silicon Valley. And Jon Pevehouse is the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations and Chairman of Political Science at UW-Madison. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us on short notice. Last week, I thought our next show would be in early September, and then I realized we had some of the leading experts on a really important subject, and I just appreciate all of you making time to share your insights with our alumni and friends. Leading us off tonight will be Mike Splinter. Mike's a 40-year veteran of the semiconductor industry with a long history of doing business in Taiwan. He's a board member at Taiwan Semiconductor and Gogoro, a Taiwanese electric scooter company. He's the chairman of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council and Nasdaq, and is a general partner at Whisk Partners, where he invests in early stage private companies in Wisconsin. He's the former chairman and CEO of Applied Materials, a global supplier of semiconductor equipment, and prior to that was a 20-year executive at Intel Corporation. Mike earned a bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering at UW-Madison's College of Engineering, and he's also served on a couple of important volunteer board roles at the university in the College of Engineering and at the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association. Mike, thank you for joining us. I don't know anyone who could tell us more about the importance of semiconductors to the U.S. economy, the global economy, and their centrality really to all of this tension that we're talking about related to U.S., China, and Taiwan. Mike, share us your thoughts about the industry and these countries.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And actually, it's quite exciting to talk about this topic. Semiconductors have been in the news over the last several years, actually. If we go back to the pre-pandemic days, President Trump put Huawei on the entity list, which banned Western companies from selling chips to them. That was really the start of a lot of supply chain disruption in the semiconductor industry. As the pandemic hit, there were shortages in a lot of different places, from automotive to games to computers to just about everywhere. And it's about that time that people realized how important semiconductors were, not only to the economy, but to the national security as well. When there's chip shortages, it's not just chip shortages for commercial companies, it's also chip shortages for military and security-oriented organizations. And it was also a realization also occurred that, gee, a lot of these chips are being made in Taiwan. And at the time, we didn't really think too much about it. Taiwan's an ally, things are going well, they make great semiconductors. But over the last few years, the tensions in the Taiwan Straits have increased and have ratcheted up, and certainly ratcheted up another notch this last week when Speaker Pelosi visited the island nation. So let's examine the situation a little bit more closely. Let's go to the next slide, Chris. Semiconductors is a $600 billion business. It's headed $1 trillion in the next few years. That's a big business. But when you think about it in terms of an $87 trillion world GDP, it's less than 1% of the world economy. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Truly, the world runs on semiconductors. Pretty much everything you can think of, phones, computers, internet, appliances, offices, cars, they all run, and the military all run on semiconductors. The semiconductors feed a multi-trillion-dollar electronics business, and that electronics business really makes the overall world economy go. The semiconductor industry is highly technical. The manufacturing is incredibly technical and complex, and the supply chain is also complex. Now, today, the U.S. manufactures about 12% of the world's chips. That's a relatively small number because we consume way more than 50% of the world's chips. And these chips, even if they were made in the United States, to get assembled into packages might take a trip to Vietnam, Malaysia, China, or Taiwan, and get assembled into packages and then get assembled into electronics units, which, like the iPhone, which end up getting sold to you. And when you think that 12% is a small number, that number is still declining. Let me show you a little data. Go to the next slide, please. Last year, the semiconductor industry spent about 100 billion, plus or minus, on building new factories. This money spent in the semiconductor industry is almost all on building new factories. So you can see by this list, if all things are created equal, of the new capacity created last year, China will have created about 30% of that. Korea and Taiwan, about 25% each. We'll get down to the US here on the list, about 8%, substantially below the 12%. The math works. The percentage that we're producing is going down, is going to continue to go down for the next few years because building these factories is very complex, takes multiple years to build them and then ramp them up into production. Let's go to the next slide. The fact that the US only builds 12% of all of its semiconductors is a relatively small number, but it produces exactly 0% of the most advanced chips. Now that might be troubling to a lot of people. So the most advanced chips used in data centers, in computers and phones, none of them are made in the US. Now, it's also true, and everyone should understand this, that China makes exactly 0% of the most advanced chips as well. So it's not like they're leading, even though they're building a lot of new factories and trying to become more self-sufficient than they are today. Let's go to the next slide. In fact, few people know, and has come more to the light and becoming more common knowledge, is that Taiwan produces 92% of the most advanced chips. Actually, I think the number is a little higher than that, but who's going to argue about 92%? And that's a big number. And you can imagine that how important those 92% of the most advanced chips in the world are and what they produce. Let's go on to the next slide. So usually when I show this 92% of the advanced chips are made in Taiwan, people go, how the hell did we let that happen? And of course, we let it happen, but we let it happen the way we let most things happen. We're a free market, free trading society. We believe in free markets. And when you believe in free markets, whoever can make it better, faster, and cheaper wins the game. And semiconductor chips are simply cheaper to be made in Asia. And actually, it's quite a bit cheaper to make them in Asia, even though the semiconductor equipment in the factories costs about the same amount no matter where you make it. The second item of how we got here is TSMC invented a better business model called the Semiconductor Foundry. Now, other people have copied this model. Global Foundries, it's a U.S. company. Samsung has copied this model as well as others. And what this model is somebody designs the semiconductor chip, the microprocessor or the radio or whatever the device might be. And then those chips are actually manufactured by somebody else. In this case, I'm saying TSMC. And the reason that this model is so much better is that you can aggregate the chip demand from many different companies and get better economy of scale than any one company can get by itself designing and manufacturing those chips. The third thing that happened is TSMC, for the most part, just executed better than anybody else. Executed better than Intel, executed better than Samsung, and executed best in the semiconductor industry. So these three factors really have led to TSMC moving into a very advanced, high market share position in the most advanced semiconductors built. And I'd like to also point out that it is very complicated and risky to have R&D in one location and have your initial volume manufacturing someplace else. Because the technologies are so complicated, pretty much every semiconductor manufacturer that builds chips has their volume production very close to their research and development center to make sure communication is smooth, fast, and problems are solved quickly. So you might say, well, why doesn't TSMC has their R&D in Taiwan? Just build someplace else, build in the United States or Europe or other places. It is very, very difficult and very risky from a business standpoint for them to do that. Let's go on to the next slide. So with this new awakening in the United States, new awareness about how important chips are, there was something called the CHIPS Act, which was signed today by President Biden. It's $52 billion of allocated money to be spent for really two purposes. One, to incentivize the building of semiconductor factories in the United States. The money will be used to level the playing field on costs between the US and Asia. And the other, that's about $37 billion. And the other $15 billion will be used for something that's going to be called the National Semiconductor Technology Center, which should enhance research being done on semiconductors throughout the country. Many universities will be involved in this research depending on their area of expertise. And hopefully the result is a workforce, both bachelor's, master's, PhDs that are going to be better suited to be able to do research in semiconductor area and once again return the United States to preeminence in the semiconductor industry. But this is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of time because not only, as I mentioned, the factories take a long time to be built, but it takes a long time to change what's happened over the last 25 years and move us from 0% of the advanced chips to some number. But let's say we're successful. Let's say we get to 15% of the most advanced chips in the world. That might help really secure the supply chain and make it a little bit more resilient. But the conclusion that you have to draw is that Taiwan is still going to make 70+% of the most advanced chips in the world. No matter what we do, no matter how much money we allocate, it's can't happen that fast. Let's go on to the next slide. So as we start to draw conclusions here, the key conclusion is Taiwan is critical to the US economy and the US security, no matter what we do, for as long as we have a clear picture into the future. So typically 10 years or something like that. For 10 years, at least, and probably much longer, Taiwan is going to be critical to the US economy and security. And we have to continue to work to mitigate that risk, but it's going to take a long time to make significant progress in that area. Let's go to the next slide. So as everyone knows, it's in the newspaper every day now, tensions are on the rise. Beijing wants to demonstrate what they can do. They can blockade Taiwan. That's what they tried to show this last week. They have missiles. They can fire over Taipei. They can incur Taiwanese airspace. And, you know, this is in large part a show. And so everybody kept cool heads during the last week. But also, we have to realize that China's economy is dependent on advanced semiconductors from Taiwan also. And if China were to attack and take over Taiwan, one of the things that is very likely to happen is you kill the golden goose. There are all kinds of sanctions on Chinese companies for advanced equipment. Actually, many of the TSMC R&D personnel are actually Americans, Chinese Americans, have spent years in Taiwan. Many Taiwanese do not want to be under Chinese rule, so there would be lots and lots of problems, and that kind of attack would throw, in my estimation, the world economy into back to the dark ages of maybe the 60s or something like that. Let's go to the last slide. So my real conclusion here is we meaning the United States and our allies, our government, and I'm very hopeful that very smart people in the US government are thinking about this and strategizing on it every day. We must do everything possible to both incentivize and deter China from taking action, military action, against Taiwan. This is absolutely critical. So with that, Mike, I'll stop here and we can go on to Alan.
Thank you for setting the stage for this discussion, Mike, as only you could. You've got a great perspective on this. And all right, so next, we'll have questions for you, Mike, shortly, but I'd like to bring in Alan Yeung, who recently rejoined his alma mater to help bring UW-Madison's world-class research to market more quickly and successfully. He's formerly Foxconn's U.S. Director of Strategic Initiatives, and he's served as a senior executive throughout Silicon Valley and the Asian Pacific markets, including Taiwan and mainland China. Alan's a native of Hong Kong. He has a degree in chemical engineering from UW-Madison, a PhD in chemical engineering from Stanford. I think he has an MBA from Berkeley as well, but I'm just ad-libbing there. Alan, thank you for joining us to give us really an inside perspective on the economic and political dynamics in and around Taiwan, as only you could do with the business experience that you've got. So really appreciate you taking time to be here.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here sharing some thoughts. And also thanks to Mike Splinter for setting the stage and actually bring up a lot of the key issues and educate us about semiconductor in Taiwan. I have to confess that I'm not an expert on China, Taiwan, or even US, although myself and my family had lived and worked in all three. and we have friends and family in all three, and therefore we would like to see things go in the correct and healthy and productive way. What I like to do is to share some news clips and also some information and add to the conversation and discourse so that actually we can get a better understanding, but also maybe find ways to get things better. So next slide, please. Mike Splinter had talked a lot about the importance of Taiwan to the world economy, to the United States, both economy and national security. But also there's a great deal of stake in Greater China. We call that mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan has been called Greater China for many years. And if you look at the data, Taiwan is as important to China, meaning mainland China and Hong Kong, as it is to the United States. In fact, even more so, if you look at the sheer numbers, Taiwan export 42% is to mainland China and Hong Kong, and 15% to the United States. Taiwan import 22% from China and 10% from the United States. And given these numbers, actually the two biggest trading partners for Taiwan actually are China and the United States. Next slide, please. If you look at the trend or the data longitudinally for the last 20 years, you can see the importance of Taiwan, both in terms of export and import. The export data from Taiwan has been quite astounding, and there are some numbers that you can actually look at and explain behind that. Going back to 2001, when China joined WTO and the globalization kicked in high gear, you can see the export from from Taiwan to the U.S. has actually dropped. And the mirror image to that is actually Taiwan exporting to China actually has grown. Some of that is the offshoring of manufacturing from the United States. Some of that would be the ICT products, other including furniture, including other substance and machineries, pharmaceutical. A lot of that got pulled into China. And Taiwan first served as a procurement office, and later on, they would add value from the high end, where the design offices, the procurement office will be located, such as in Korea, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. But production went to Southeast Asia and China, and eventually a great chunk of that going to China. But if you look at the import, next slide, please. A lot of the export or import coming in also reflect China being very important to Taiwan. It actually gone from 7% in 2001 to now well over 20% in 2020. Part of that is, besides some of the raw materials, the semi-finished goods, fruits and other foodstuffs also coming in from China. And some of the raw materials are coming in from China. So the point that I like to make is that as important as Taiwan is to the United States, is actually quite important or equally important for Taiwan to be part of China in terms of economic development and also high-tech development. Not to mention some of the geopolitical and historical perspective. What I like to do, besides pointing out that Taiwan is important to China and the U.S., I also want to bring up a couple points about historical narrative and perspective. So next slide, please. There's been a lot of talk about China and Taiwan and whether Taiwan had ever been a part of China, and also whether Taiwan has been ruled or governed by China or PRC. If you look at history, Taiwan had always been China or part of China if you include the Qing dynasty or Imperial China. So going back 200 or 300 years, it has been that case for a long, long time. But it's also very true that Taiwan has never been ruled by PRC. When the nationalists went to Taiwan in 1949, it has been a government and self-government area or region, and in some cases recognized by a few countries as nation by itself. So that's where the controversy comes in. And part of that also is when you talk to the 1.3 or 1.4 billion people in China and ask them whether Taiwan is part of China, you would get a super majority of them saying yes. I think they meant that Taiwan is part of China. They would not mean that PRC had ever ruled Taiwan. So those are the nuances and the intricacies that we should actually be aware of. Next slide, please. Lately, we have been talking about whether the status quo has changed, and there's a lot of citation about how China become recognized by the United States, United Nations, and the West. And you go back to some of the joint communiques, the 6 assurances, and there's only one China. But some of our statements in the U.S. by our leaders and by our strategic ambiguity, and then had to be walked back later on, really did not help, because when you make statements like that, it raised a certain level of suspicion or maybe even distrust in the minds of the mainland Chinese and perhaps even their leaders. By the same token, when we make some changes on our official website, such as the website for the State Department, taking out key clauses, changing the content into some of our so-called, highlight and, whether we support autonomous or independence and things like that, it really drives a lot of the tension to a next level and actually bring up the controversy. So subsequently, when they change the content back, again, it really doesn't help in terms of mutual understanding. In a long story short, I think you can say status quo is changing, whether the Chinese started that, whether the Americans started that, whether if you speak to Taiwanese in Taiwan, they would, of course, say status quo is never the same because we've been advancing, we've been making progress, and Taiwan has been advancing to become a very advanced society. It is actually a democracy and is very high tech, is very capable. The speed, the efficiency, and the capabilities is all there. So it's difficult to say status quo is not changing at all. Next slide, please. And if you look at what happened the past 3 years, starting with, the Trump administration, some of the sanctions and the trade war, and later on with COVID-19, and now with the conflict and the war in Ukraine, it really brings to the forefront the global supply chain have morphed into what our previous employer and the CEO had said. In the year 2030, the world might have been led by the so-called G2, which is the United States and China, and the combined GDP would be actually greater than the next 17 or 18 economies combined. If you look at the last few years, when the global supply chain start reshoring and there's some security issues, maybe sanctions being placed, G2 has now started morphing a little bit more into global north and global south, and some of the BRICS country or BRICS plus, with export in commodities, in oil and gas, maybe the raw materials, start more moving to the so-called global south. So the world supply chains is not actually getting more and more integrated, it's actually morphing into two factions per se. Next slide, please. And to look at different ways of the supply chain, or actually how the world is changing into two blocks, I would use the framework from my former employer, and we talk and call that 6 flows. We talk about supply chains, that would be one of them, logistic, finished goods, or raw material. But if you look at people, you look at the cash flow or the capital flow or the store or value, you look at technology, information, and business processes, that's all changing. And Taiwan plays a very strategic role in partnership with the United States, and also become a key portion of the Greater China story here. One example with the business process, Many of you actually don't know that 25, 30 years ago, Taiwan became the global procurement office for electronics, for information technology, also including maybe even furniture and other commodities. So if you go to Taiwan American School and Southern International School in Taiwan, you can see a lot of employers putting their employees there and their families and the children attending this international school. So if Taiwan become blockade or go into political or military issues and challenges, the procurement process actually will be upended. By the same token, as Mike Splinter mentioned earlier, when Huawei was actually suffering from the sanction for the Trump administration, they could not buy 5G chipset from TSMC or from some of the Western supplier. That changed the supply chain, that also changes the technology flow. And if you look at the people, with now the sanction on Speaker Pelosi and her family, more and more people are no longer allowed to travel to different countries or area, including, for example, or Taiwan or China. If you look at some of the examples I point out, next slide, please. One example is ASML, which is a Dutch equipment manufacturer for semiconductor. The world right now is supplied by 4 or 5 main countries for semiconductor equipment. One of them, of course, is America, including Applied Materials, Lam Research. Other countries, including the Netherlands, Japan, or Singapore, they actually responsible for the bulk of the world's tools and equipment provider. And right now, the United States is pushing the Dutch government to stop selling even the older chip manufacturing equipment to China. The very high-end stuff, the so-called EUV, had already been banned. This is really just a couple of months of July 2022. If you look back a few days ago, a news story coming out from Wall Street Journal talking about Southeast Asia, the ASEAN country, had to tiptoe through the rivalry between the United States and China in terms of trade, in terms of economic policy, and maybe even the geopolitical situation. I would say myself personally, and a few companies out there, and as the Wall Street Journal article alluded to, quite a few countries would prefer to stay neutral and not to take sides. As many of you have heard before, one of my former employees would say, the Chinese market is a big market. We don't want to abandon that. The American market is a big market, and the EU market is a big market. So many enterprises would not like to serve one or the other. They would like to be able to serve both. So I think it is in the best interest that we find a way to cool off the tension and find ways to actually de-risk and actually de-escalate the situation, even though this is not some of the things that we would do as normal citizens or maybe supplier and enterprises. Next slide. And another example is with the world bifurcating into different factions and sanctions being imposed and slapped on different countries, especially in Russia, it really gives people pauses what's going to happen next. So it's going to drive countries and other factions into looking for alternatives. It probably would not be in our best interest to see the world not using the US dollar as a reserve currency. And, some of the actions and things happening, for example, last week, Russia is now starting to sell bonds based on RMB, and also based on the Deloitte, statement or article. People are now questioning that, hey, would RMB become one of the global currency, coming after the US dollar, euro, Japanese yen, etc. So things are changing, and I would dare say that status quo is no longer the same. Next slide. So in conclusion, what I would like to leave with you is that the world is changing and the pack are bifurcating, and Taiwan is in the midst of it, and it is very important to the United States. Thank you.
Alan, thank you for a great presentation. Between you and Mike, we've set the stage now to zoom out And we'll hear from Jon Pevehouse, the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations and Chair of the Political Science Department at UW-Madison. His research interests lie in international relations and political economy, American foreign policy, international organizations, and political methodology. He is the co-author of the leading textbook on international politics, and he was the editor of International Organization, the leading journal in the field of international relations. So in spite of earning a PhD at Ohio State, Jon, we welcome you yet again and look forward to your thoughts on the more macro situation between the U.S., China, and Taiwan.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. As always, it's great to join you at UW now, and thanks to Mike and Alan too, who, as you say, set the stage really well. So, as you indicated, I'm going to kind of step out a little bit and look at some of the broader geopolitical dynamics of the region, and I hope I don't end by alarming everyone or sounding alarmist, because I'm really not. I'm more of an optimist, despite going to Ohio State, but I'll say there's some kind of structural long-run forces at work here that have me very worried. Have me worried about Mike's call to, have the U.S. deter China, and have me worried about sort of Alan's idea that, if we could all get along, we could facilitate more efficient international exchange, which would probably put more money in all of our pockets. But I think there's some, unfortunately, as always, political forces behind here. So there's been a lot of attention this week on Nancy Pelosi's visit. That's kind of what spurred this conversation and many conversations around the country and around the globe this last week. And a lot of sort of blaming, and of course, whether you think this was a good or bad visit may depend heavily on your own political affiliation in this country. But I would say, I think of McGeorge Bundy's statement after the U.S. escalated in Vietnam after the attack on the Pleiku Air Base. He said, Pleikus are like streetcars. You wait long enough, one will come around. It was Pelosi's visit. If it wasn't Pelosi's visit, it would have been something else, because I agree with Alan here. With Mike here. This was a show of force, right? This was a very significant show of force on the part of the Chinese to sort of try to convince the world, and the United States in particular, that it was much stronger. The last really significant military crisis around Taiwan happened between 1995 and 1996, what we call the third Taiwan Straits crisis, after the one in 54 and 58. And that was set off by the president of Taiwan visiting his alma mater, Cornell, and giving him a visa to do so, which angered the Chinese. The outcome of that was that the U.S. Mobilized the largest naval force since Vietnam to patrol Taiwan Straits. And the lesson that China took from that in 1995 was that they cannot stop that. They cannot stop the United States from defending Taiwan. We had a very effective deterrent force. And so what did China do as a response? They massively increased defense spending. In 1995, the Chinese defense budget, by our best estimate, was about 2 times that of Taiwan. Today, it's 20 times that of Taiwan. And they have made, in particular on the naval side, they've made an effort to really expand their blue water capabilities and to be able to sort of patrol and effectively shut off access to the Taiwan Straits. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about what the U.S. is trying to do as countermeasures to that, largely which is to get allies in the region like Japan and South Korea to help us out. And so that's been the long run goal of China, is to try to be able to deter and stop the U.S. from being able to intervene in the region, at will. And so that's sort of that's some background characteristics. What are the two kind of debates, or I think long run situations that have me concerned? Number one is an internal Chinese situation, which is that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has spent the last decade-ish greatly consolidating his power. And in particular, I would say in the last 3 to 4 years, increasingly showing more uses of force, becoming increasingly aggressive on the military side, whether it is this tremendous action taken this week in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit, whether it is claiming airspace over the Japanese islands around Senkaku, whether it is taking small bits of territory from India in the Himalayas, whether it is continuing to dredge up islands in the South China Sea and claim those as Chinese military bases. The increasing amount of sort of aggressive behavior on the part of China in the region has really been parallel with the growth of Xi Jinping's power. And I guess one of the narratives I want to sort of focus on here is that when you have countries with very little, that are authoritarian, with very little accountability, and you have an increasing consolidation of power, you see things like we saw in Ukraine in February, right? You see the Vladimir Putin's going in, sort of unchecked by military advisors, going in and making massive military miscalculations. Is China there right now? No, I don't think so. But the trend line is there, and that should have us all a bit concerned. Now, the flip side of that is what people put all their hope in is they say, well, but look, and both Mike and Alan made this point that there's this tremendous economic interdependence. China needs Taiwan, Taiwan needs China. This is again is a long 200-year-old theory of international relations. Goes back to the Manchester School of Thought in England in the 18th century, early 19th century. This idea that when you trade with one another, you don't want to fight with one another, and all of the data that Alan showed you certainly would speak to that point. And so that's the people who sort of are more on the there will be peace side of this, who would argue against the Xi Jinping consolidation and sort of reckless behavior argument, would say that at the end of the day, it's it's the dollar, the renminbi, the yuan, right, that's going to rule the day, not politics. And between 2008 and 2016, the previous Taiwanese president, President Ma, did a lot of work to really expand economic interdependence. He signed a number of treaties with China, increasing, on basic logistics like mail, and those types of agreements. To this day, China has started to say they're going to walk away from these, right? The current president, the DPP party, the current party in power in Taiwan, has sort of done the opposite. Rather than saying we're going to increase interdependence with China, Taiwan is attempting to pull that away. Now, as Alan's data showed you, they failed, right? Or at least they've in part failed. Taiwan's trade with its other 15, 16 greatest partners has also increased significantly in the last decade, but not at the same rate that it has with China. So despite, especially the current party's efforts to sort of loosen those economic bonds, it's not worked very well. Taiwan has also diplomatically tried very hard to get into more multilateral trading regimes, both multilateral regimes in Asia and more globally, and they've not had great success at doing so, largely because China threatens partners and would try to keep them out. And so Taiwan's been really limited on its ability to kind of expand its partnerships abroad. And as a relatively small country, that's difficult for them to do. They're not the U.S., they're not Germany, they're not China. So even though they have a dynamic economy, well-educated population, there just are limits given its size. And so the bottom line is there is this interdependence. We think it's important. It probably does serve as a damper on conflict. But despite Taiwan's efforts to kind of move out of this interdependence, they've been unable to do so. I would also say, coming back to Ukraine, one reason we should be hopeful about this interdependence argument has to do with the global response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think one of Putin's miscalculations in that war was assuming that the world wouldn't care, much as it didn't care in 2014 when they took Crimea. But the world did care, right? And we've had significant economic sanctions on Russia. Similar economic sanctions could really put the screws to China. China knows that. It would hurt China. But of course, that assumes that the US, Japan, the EU would have the same response to a Chinese incursion into Taiwan. Is that going to be the case? Maybe, maybe not. And again, I would say the limits of this trade and interdependence argument is just what I said earlier. There could be miscalculation, right? If Xi Jinping continues on this effort to really surround himself with sycophants, to not listen to what the naysayers may be saying to him about Chinese military strategy, about Chinese military power, that could be a dangerous situation to be in. So I just want to throw that out there. The final two quick points I want to make. I would, first of all, for those kind of watching who kind of want to follow Chinese events, there's and politics, geopolitics around China, there's a growing debate in Washington and in Europe about whether we've seen peak China. And in fact, if you kind of Google that phrase, peak China, you'll see dozens and dozens of thought papers and white papers about, is China itself on the decline, right? And lots of people can marshal data to suggest this, right? There's been a significant decline in FDI in and out of China. There's slowing GDP growth in China. And of course, some of this is about the pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, this this literature existed and folks were thinking about this. Most of the GDP growth that is happening in China in recent years has come from internal spending, right? It's self-driven growth. It's government consumption growth in China. You've got this odd demographic situation in China. If we think demographics are destiny, post-war in China, Mao encouraged a massive population boom, right? Which is when Chinese population growth really takes off. Then they completely put the brakes with one child, in the 70s. And so you had this massive population boom with not many old people that they needed to support on social systems because of the war, unfortunately. And then all of a sudden you've got no kids. This massive group has no kids, or they have one child. So you had this tremendous bubble of population moving through China that was incredibly productive. They're now retiring. They're hitting retirement age, right? And so now you're going to have tremendous demographic and domestic pressures on China to increase domestic spending. All the while with their FDI declining, their aid declining. People point to things like Belt and Road. Many of China's promises about the expansion of Belt and Road have gone unfulfilled. Alan's map showing Argentina, right, as sort of part of the BRICS group is interesting because about 8 or 9 years ago when the IMF had to bail out Argentina again, China came to the rescue as well and promised tens of billions of dollars. They've delivered almost none of that, right, over the last 3 years. China has walked away from this and these commitments. And in fact, the last 2 years, China's Export-Import Bank has given $0 to all of Latin America, where in the past they were giving much significant amounts. I believe up to 100 billion in some years. And so, this is a huge change. And so people look at this data and they say, have we seen peak China? Is that good news for Taiwan? Is that good news for geopolitics? Depends on who you ask. On one hand, you might think that would make China more gun shy. The flip side is, if I'm leading China and I've consolidated power and I see my economy starting to go down the tank, I need to really create some kind of nationalist moment, right? And there's one way to do that, one very straightforward way to do that, and that's become more bellicose in East Asia. Last point I want to make is about the United States. Alan, I agree with Alan in the sense of it would be great if, we could put politics aside and all get along and advance economics. The problem is right now, I think one of the few bipartisan issues you have in the United States is China, and it is anti-China rhetoric. And Republicans and Democrats, and Alan showed some examples of this in the news. There's tremendous pressure in Congress from the executive branch to limit Western companies' ability to do business with China. And that's only going to continue. And in fact, you look at elections, and you're going to see this in the midterm elections, and you're going to see it in the next presidential election. No one's going to be standing out there saying, you know what, we need to be good to China. It's going to be the opposite. And that's only going to escalate the economic and the political tensions. There's a domestic political incentive in the United States right now to make China the bad country, right? To make them out, even with Russia, it's fulfilling that for the time being. There's long-run political incentives, and you've got both parties in a sense trying to outbid one another in the United States as who can be tougher on China. So that side is not going to get better anytime soon. And so again, I didn't want to kind of end on the alarmist note, but I would say generally speaking, there are some of these deep structural factors that I think are going to make life difficult and politics very difficult for geopolitics between China, Taiwan, and the United States. Thanks.
Thank you, Jon. Well, the all-star panel that we've assembled has delivered. I'll say that. I've got a few questions that have come in from the chat and some of my own. I'm going to fire them off pretty quickly in succession here. So Charlie Weiss had a question that I think belongs to Mike Splinter, which is, where did Taiwan get the equipment to build the most advanced chips in the world?
Well, Alan alluded to this, but there are 5 major chip manufacturing equipment companies. 3 of them are in the United States. One, Tokyo Electron, obviously in Tokyo, and ASML is in the Netherlands. There are hundreds and hundreds of other companies, but those 5 companies predominantly control the semiconductor manufacturing equipment market. And Taiwan Semiconductor can buy freely from all of those.
Mike, you had suggested that a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Wouldn't a takeover give them control of that goose, or are you thinking it would not work as it is now with a takeover?
I'm thinking it would not work as it is now. For one thing, there are sanctions on what equipment China can get. They can't get the advanced semiconductor equipment. There are sanctions on that. In fact, China today is about 4 generations behind in semiconductor technology. They haven't really caught up after spending hundreds of billions of dollars in this field. So I just think it would be very, very problematic for them to try to create an environment where TSMC would continue to thrive, and other high-tech companies in Taiwan.
Understood. Another question, although because it came from a UW professor, let's say it's a quiz. If Taiwan Foundries were incapacitated, who would be making the most advanced chips in the world at that point?
Samsung.
And
from South Korea.
And after
they
Samsung,
have most, pardon me?
And after Samsung, who do you think is next?
Intel Corporation.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to go to a couple questions that I think might be more in Alan's wheelhouse. Alan, China's been cracking down of late on the tech industry. You know, we see a lot of that in the media. Is the semiconductor industry a darling in China, or are they under some pressure and scrutiny as well?
That's a tough question, but let me try to give some perspective. I think cracking down in the sense that some of the new economy companies have been going through quite a bit of M&A and consolidation, and the market concentration for these companies have gone up a lot. And just like in the United States, we didn't really regulate internet, we didn't really regulate e-commerce. I think it was also quite true in China. But China and Chinese government decided to do exactly that a few years ago. And therefore, you're seeing the concentration of power in the US with some of our leading companies. They are still not checked, but I think there's some mumbling now in Washington, D.C. that maybe our regulators is beginning to take a look at these companies too. And I wouldn't name them, but you know who they are. The semiconductor industry, I think as Mike said earlier, Chinese care and don't care about what chips they make, because they have gone from practically zero to actually being one of the largest manufacturers of semiconductors in the world, and they're exporting quite a bit of that. But I think they are also a consumer of it, so they would welcome any capacity improvement. But getting to where the Taiwanese are right now, I don't think anybody had done it and could do it in the foreseeable future. I think we mentioned Intel. Intel is trying, and Samsung actually is quite a little bit behind. But if you look at the geopolitics, is 60% of the global foundry volume is in Taiwan. And if you add China and if you add South Korea, practically all the capacity is in that powder cake. And people actually equate the Middle East and, petroleum from the 70s and the 80s as strategic vital area for the U.S. Now, semiconductor being the same for the U.S. in the 21st century, 2020 and 30, is even actually more critical. I think drilling oil is not easy, but really getting to that 3 nanometer or even beyond that, and looking at other compound semiconductor, the world leaders are still over there, whether it's Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly China. These are the 4 countries that actually can rival and in some cases exceeded American technologies. And we had a lot of advances here, but when we have to get to the fab and go make them, we all go to Taiwan and China and South Korea and Japan. That's the trouble here. And that to us, economically and national security wise, is actually even more dire than the 70s, 80s for the oil.
Thank you. Jon Pevehouse, you mentioned whether the lessons in the Russian-Ukraine crisis might not be influencing thinking in China. But, Russia, while it's strategically important for Europe for oil and gas because of the pipelines, at least for a short-term period, is a pretty small player in global trade relative to China. And of course, you and I both know gains from trade are equal on both sides. So if we decide to impose that level of sanctions on China, the loss to us is going to be collectively as great as the loss to them, us being, let's say, Western countries that import a lot of goods from China and increasingly sell a lot there. So are we really going to be as excited about imposing that level of sanctions on China if they act?
No, absolutely not. And I think that's what should keep us up at night about the trade leads to peace, trade deters war argument, is that China knows it would suffer, but so would the West. And look, even in the Ukraine case, right? Like Germany took 3 months to decide they actually probably didn't want Russian resources after all. It wasn't overnight. And you could imagine that with these incredibly important technological manufacturing industries that both Alan and Mike were referring to on the Chinese side, like that's, that gets cut off in this. And this goes to, Mike's answer to that first question about, can you just take the golden goose? You can. I don't know on the technology, there may be technological reasons to say that. And yes, which means then of course you would sanction, and the US would say, well, we won't buy from them. And Europe would say, we won't buy from any product that comes out of these captured markets then. But as this whole discussion has been about, what does that leave you then? Where do you get? And to Alan's point, he's right. Like there are substitutes for oil. They're expensive and they're hard. We develop them quickly. It's not clear to me there are substitutes for semiconductors.
Yeah. Alan, your former boss ran for president of Taiwan previously, and there's another election coming in Taiwan. There's an election coming in China. How do these tensions shape those elections, specifically in Taiwan? And are the Taiwanese trending one way or the other? Is this tension driving them in one direction or the other, or is it just escalating views on each side?
Mike, I can't tell you what the politics is like in the U.S., let alone Taiwan, but I can maybe make a couple comments here. Is that looking at Ukraine, and we don't know whether there are any peace talk being held in the back channel. I hope that would be. Otherwise, it's a one-way street at the moment. There's no end in sight, and there's tremendous tragedies and death and destruction there. I think for China, for Taiwan, and the U.S., we gotta have dialogues, and we gotta have different sides that you can listen to, and we gotta have people who are willing to be peacemaker. So I would hope the future leaders for Taiwan, for China, and for the United States, whether they are the same leaders currently, because some may actually get reelected, or some may actually get newly elected in the future, we hope they also be open-minded and actually can converse and can actually make deals so that we go to the normalization route, so that things will go in the positive, constructive way, as opposed to go down to the spiral where things actually looking right now, as John mentioned before, because whether you change the status quo or I did, the point is the relationship are deteriorating rapidly. And if nobody is speaking anything positive for China and seeing negative 100% across the board, yeah, the dire situation, the consequences will be worse, a lot worse in Taiwan than in Ukraine, and a lot worse for our relationship with the world and with China. That, I don't think you need an expert to say that. Even I can tell.
It does seem that the world's technical intelligence has outstripped our emotional intelligence for the moment. And we we really need to work on that. Jon Pevehouse, I'm going to give that to you as an assignment.
Next show.
Next show, yeah, we're at the top of the hour, and I promised everyone we would wrap on time. And again, I can't thank you enough. What a great program this evening. Really appreciate the expertise you all bring, every one of you. Terrific presentations and great Q&A, and I know our audience really appreciates all of this. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really a pleasure. So thanks again to our audience. Probably no surprises next week. We'll probably be back in September, but I hope you've enjoyed our speakers this evening. Very informative to me, at least. I hope it was to you as well. Thanks for joining us, and on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a badger. Because we badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a badger.